Hi there, and welcome to Ku English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. The Silent Power of Words. The Life of Anton Pavlovich Chekhov. Chapter 1. The Town of Taganrog. Anton Pavlovich Chekhov came into the world on January 29, 1860, in the southern Russian town of Taganrog. The town, resting on the edge of the Azov Sea, was neither a great capital nor a forgotten village. It was a busy port where the smell of salt water mixed with coal smoke, and where men spoke not only Russian, but also Greek, Turkish, and Italian, depending on which ship had recently anchored in the harbor. The rhythm of Taganrog was shaped by trade. Fishermen carried nets heavy with their catch through the narrow streets, while merchants argued over prices in crowded markets. For a boy with watchful eyes, the place offered endless scenes to observe. Anton's family lived above a small grocery shop that belonged to his father, Pavel. The shop was dim and smelled of dried fish, pickled cucumbers, and cheap wine. Shelves sagged under the weight of dusty bottles and sacks of grain. Life there was not gentle. Pavel, a stern man with a quick temper, struggled constantly to keep the business alive. He believed that hard work and strict discipline were the only ways to survive. To his children, he was both teacher and tyrant. His voice often carried the edge of command, and when he grew angry, the household fell silent. Yet the Chekhov household was not without warmth. Anton's mother, Yevgenia, provided balance to her husband's severity. She was a gentle, imaginative woman who loved to tell stories of her youth in the countryside. Around the table, while the younger children listened wide-eyed, she described fields filled with flowers, local festivals, and the laughter of neighbors long gone. These stories gave Anton an early sense that life was more than duty and hardship. There was also wonder hidden in everyday moments. Later in life, he would remember her storytelling as the true beginning of his artistic education. The family's apartment was cramped. Anton shared space with his 5 siblings, 3 brothers and 2 sisters. Privacy was rare, and quarrels were common, yet the closeness forced them to know each other deeply. Music was also part of daily life. Pavel, proud of his role as choir director at the local church, required all his children to sing. Rehearsals stretched into long evenings, when Anton's voice, still soft and boyish, joined with others under flickering candlelight. Sometimes his eyelids grew heavy with fatigue, but his father demanded perfection. This strict training gave Anton discipline, though it also left scars of fear and submission. Taganrog itself offered Anton another kind of education. The streets were full of characters: old men sitting outside shops, gossiping women carrying baskets, beggars at the corners, sailors telling exaggerated tales of storms and faraway lands. As he wandered, he observed details: the curve of a mustache, the slouch of tired shoulders, the tone of laughter that could be both joyful and cruel. These early impressions stored themselves silently in his mind, like seeds waiting to grow. The town was also marked by sharp social contrasts. Near the Chekhov's modest home stood the elegant mansions of merchants and officials. Behind high fences were gardens, fountains, and large windows glowing with light during evening gatherings. Anton saw both sides of life: the tight rooms of the poor, where air smelled of smoke and cabbage, and the bright halls of the wealthy, where voices rang with confidence. This awareness of inequality became part of his inner world, shaping the quiet compassion that would later define his writing. Despite hardships, young Anton found joy in small discoveries. He often wandered toward the sea. The waves of the Azov were not grand like the oceans in books, but for a boy they seemed infinite. Standing on the shore, he listened to gulls crying above the masts, and felt the salt wind brush against his face. The sea gave him a sense of distance and possibility, a feeling that beyond the horizon there must be larger worlds waiting. At school, Anton was not the loudest pupil. Teachers noticed his calmness and his quick humor, often expressed in short, clever remarks rather than long speeches. He liked to draw caricatures of classmates and scribble small jokes in the margins of his notebooks. These early sketches were not only playful, but also sharp in observation. He was learning, without knowing it, the first tools of a writer: to notice, to capture, and to distill. Still, life at home often overshadowed school. The family's financial situation was unstable. Pavel's shop rarely prospered, and debts grew. Creditors sometimes appeared at the door, voices raised, demanding payment. Anton, though still a child, sensed the shame that fell upon his family. The tension of poverty pressed heavily on him, but it also taught him resilience. He learned how to laugh even when life was difficult, and how to endure silently when there was no choice. There were moments, however, when joy broke through. On Orthodox feast days, Taganrog, filled with processions, colorful banners, choirs, and the sweet smell of incense drifting from the church. Children ran with excitement, women wore their best dresses, and bells rang so loudly they seemed to shake the sky. For Anton, such days were like sudden bursts of color in an otherwise gray routine. He stored the contrast, the solemn faces of worshippers, the noise of the crowd, the shimmer of candles, as carefully as he stored the darker details of home. Anton's earliest reading also left strong impressions. Though books were few in the house, he discovered Russian classics and translated European works in school libraries. He read not only for knowledge but for escape, traveling in imagination to distant lands. At times he would retell what he had read to his brothers and sisters, adjusting details, adding humor, or sharpening suspense. Without realizing it, he was already practicing the art of narration. In Taganrog, the boy Anton lived between extremes: the stern shadow of his father and the gentle warmth of his mother, the cramped shop and the open sea, poverty and glimpses of wealth. He was not yet the writer who would one day change world literature, but the roots were forming. The sharp discipline of his father gave him strength to endure, while his mother's stories gave him the ability to see life in colors beyond survival. The streets of Taganrog, filled with sailors, merchants, beggars, and priests, became his first stage, teaching him that every life, however small, carries its own story. It was in this town, with its salty winds and narrow streets, that Anton Chekhov began to observe humanity, not as a distant idea, but as a daily reality. Each voice, each gesture, each silence became part of the mosaic he would later transform into literature. Taganrog was not only his birthplace. It was the first chapter of his education in the quiet, powerful art of seeing. Chapter 2. A Childhood in Shadows and Light. Childhood is often remembered as a time of innocence, yet for Anton Chekhov it was also a time of struggle, responsibility, and quiet discovery. His early years were marked by the strict hand of his father, the gentle presence of his mother, and the constant shadow of poverty. These forces created an atmosphere where discipline and hardship stood side by side with imagination and curiosity, shaping the boy who would one day become one of the most delicate observers of human life. Anton's father, Pavel, believed in order, obedience, and piety. He was a religious man, deeply devoted to the Russian Orthodox Church, and he demanded that his children follow the same path. From a young age, Anton and his brothers were required to sing in the church choir that Pavel directed. The rehearsals took place several times a week, sometimes stretching late into the night. Candlelight flickered against the walls as the boys sang hymns in cold, echoing halls. Anton's voice blended with his siblings, carrying both the beauty of the liturgy and the weight of his father's authority. For Pavel, music was not just about faith, but also discipline. A missed note or a lack of concentration could provoke his anger. Punishments were swift and harsh, leaving the children fearful of making mistakes. In later years, Anton rarely spoke openly about the severity of his upbringing, but the memory of his father's temper remained with him. Still, even within this strict environment, something valuable was planted. The discipline of music taught him about rhythm, about the power of silence, and about the emotional force that lies beneath sound. These lessons, though painful at times, later reappeared in his writing and plays, where pauses and silences carried meaning as deep as spoken words. If his father represented shadow, then his mother represented light. Yevgenia was gentle, kind, and imaginative. She often told her children stories about her own childhood, about rural villages and festive traditions. Her tales were not grand epics, but simple stories of people, laughter, and small adventures. She spoke with warmth, and Anton absorbed every detail, the colors of dresses, the smells of food, the sound of laughter around the fire. Years later, Chekhov would admit that from his father he inherited strictness, but from his mother, his soul. Her stories taught him to see the world with compassion, to notice the humanity hidden in ordinary lives. The Chekhov family home was crowded and noisy. Anton shared his life with 5 siblings, 3 brothers and 2 sisters. Arguments were frequent, but so was laughter. The children invented games, shared secrets, and occasionally plotted small rebellions against their father's rigid rules. Anton, though not the oldest, quickly became known among his siblings for his sharp wit. He would draw funny sketches, mimic voices, and invent little scenes that made his brothers and sisters laugh even when the family's situation felt heavy. This humor was more than entertainment. It was survival, a way to transform hardship into something bearable. Poverty was a constant presence. The grocery shop downstairs rarely brought enough income. Shelves stood half empty, and creditors often appeared at the door. Anton learned early what it meant to live with debt and with the fear of losing everything. At times, the family had little more than bread and cabbage to eat. The children wore patched clothes, and their shoes often leaked in the wet Taganrog winters. Yet, despite these difficulties, Anton's curiosity never dimmed. He explored the town's streets, listening to the gossip of neighbors, the laughter of sailors, and the complaints of beggars. Every person, he seemed to understand, carried a story worth noticing. School became another important part of his childhood. Anton attended the local Greek school, where he studied not only Russian but also Greek and Latin. He was not the best student in every subject, but teachers noticed his intelligence and his quick humor. He had a special gift for storytelling. If a lesson grew dull, he would quietly entertain classmates with a whispered joke or a clever drawing in the margins of his notebook. These early performances made him popular among peers and hinted at the storyteller he was becoming. Books played a central role in his childhood as well. Though his family owned few, Anton found ways to borrow from neighbors or read in the school library. He devoured Russian classics, stories of saints, and even translated works of European authors. Reading became both escape and education. Through books, Anton traveled beyond Taganrog, imagining worlds of castles, deserts, and foreign cities. At the same time, he learned the power of words, the way they could build an image so strong that one felt transported to another place. What is remarkable is how Anton combined imagination with observation. Unlike some children who read only to dream, he read in order to compare. He looked at the people around him, the shopkeeper with a crooked back, the sailor missing a finger, the old woman carrying baskets of onions, and measured them against the characters he found in books. Slowly, he began to understand that literature was not only about faraway lands, but also about the lives unfolding around him every day. There were also moments of deep loneliness. The strictness of his father and the financial struggles of the family sometimes left Anton feeling isolated. He often walked alone to the seashore, where he could watch the endless horizon. There, the boy who was trapped in poverty could dream of distance and freedom. The sea became a kind of teacher, whispering to him that life stretched far beyond the narrow streets of Taganrog. That sense of distance would later echo in his stories, where characters often gazed through windows or across fields, longing for something just beyond reach. The balance of shadows and light in Anton's childhood is perhaps the key to understanding his later art. From his father, he learned discipline, duty, and the hardness of life. From his mother, he inherited imagination, kindness, and humor. From poverty, he learned resilience, and from books, the possibility of other worlds. The mixture of these experiences gave him a perspective both tender and unsentimental. He saw life as it was harsh, beautiful, absurd, and fragile. By the time Anton reached his early teens, he already displayed qualities that would mark his adult life: a sharp eye for detail, a love for humor, and a quiet endurance in the face of hardship. Though the years ahead would bring even greater trials, including separation from his family and the burden of responsibility. The foundation of his character had been built during these childhood days in Taganrog. In this way, Anton's childhood was not a simple tale of misery or of joy, but a complex weaving of both. Shadows and light lived together in the small apartment above the grocery shop. The strict voice of his father and the gentle stories of his mother created a harmony of opposites. This duality, experienced so early, became part of Chekhov's vision of life, never purely tragic, never purely comic, but always both at once. It was in these formative years that he began, without knowing it, to train the eyes and ears of a writer, gathering the raw material that would later blossom into stories and plays admired across the world. Chapter 3: The Weight of Family and Responsibility. When Anton Chekhov was 16, a sudden storm fell upon his family. The small grocery shop that had been his father's pride collapsed under the burden of debts. Creditors pressed harder than ever, and Pavel, fearing disgrace and even prison, gathered his wife and children and fled to Moscow. The decision was quick, almost desperate, and left little room for the children's opinions. In the rush, Anton was left behind in Taganrog to finish his studies. It was a harsh separation. For the first time, the boy who had always been surrounded by brothers, sisters, and his mother's gentle presence, now found himself largely alone. His father's stern voice no longer echoed in the evenings, but neither did his mother's warmth. The absence was profound. Anton was left in a world of cold rented rooms, unpaid bills, and long school days, carrying a weight far heavier than his age. The room he rented was small and damp, with a ceiling stained by leaks. Winters in Taganrog were unforgiving. Frost crept across the window panes, and Anton often studied by the weak glow of an oil lamp, his breath visible in the air. Money was scarce. To survive, he tutored younger pupils in mathematics and literature. The pay was meager, but it was enough to keep bread on the table and rent paid, though sometimes only barely. Hunger became a familiar companion. Yet even in such conditions, Anton showed a resilience that astonished those who knew him. During the day, he continued his schooling at the Taganrog Gymnasium, a strict institution modeled on classical education. The curriculum included Latin, Greek, and religious studies, and the teachers were known for their severity. Many students feared their punishments, but Anton learned how to navigate the system with humor and tact. He was not always the top student, but he excelled in literature and displayed an unusual ability to write vivid compositions. His essays, often sprinkled with humor, revealed both a keen intellect and a fresh voice that teachers found hard to ignore. But the true education he received during these lonely years came not from classrooms, but from life itself. Forced to manage his own affairs, Anton became disciplined in ways that would remain with him for the rest of his life. He learned to budget every coin, to cook simple meals, to mend his clothes, and to find lightness even in adversity. Often, he entertained himself by sketching short comedic scenes about daily life, which he would share with classmates or publish in small local magazines for a little extra income. Loneliness was heavy, but it sharpened his powers of observation. Walking through the streets of Taganrog alone, Anton noticed things he might have overlooked before: the way old men gathered outside the church to argue over politics, the sharp bargaining of women in the market, the hopeless eyes of beggars on cold mornings. He also observed his own classmates with a new distance, seeing how pride, fear, and ambition shaped their actions. Slowly, he began to realize that human behavior, in all its variety, was his greatest subject. Letters from Moscow brought both comfort and pain. His family described their struggles in the capital, where they lived in cramped quarters and barely survived on small earnings. Pavel was unable to provide steady income, and the older brothers tried to take any work available. For Anton, the news deepened his sense of responsibility. Though he was the middle child, he felt an obligation to support his family as soon as he could. This burden of responsibility, assumed early, carried silently, became one of the defining features of his character. In the midst of hardship, Anton still found room for humor. His letters to his family often included small jokes and playful drawings designed to lift their spirits. Even in the darkest times, he resisted bitterness. Instead, he turned pain into something lighter, more bearable. This ability to find comedy in tragedy would later define his art, where tears and laughter often existed side by side. By 1876, Anton's situation grew even more difficult. The room he rented became too expensive, and he was forced to move into poorer lodgings. Sometimes he lived with relatives or family friends, enduring their rules and their pity. At one point, he stayed with a Greek merchant's family, where he was treated less like a guest and more like a servant. These humiliations left their mark, but they also taught him humility and empathy. He came to understand what it meant to depend on the mercy of others, and this awareness of vulnerability would later shape the compassion in his stories. Yet, in the middle of hardship, there were also moments of awakening. In 1877, he wrote his first small play, performed by classmates at the gymnasium. It was a short, humorous sketch, poking fun at local officials. The audience laughed, and Anton experienced the thrill of seeing words come alive on stage. Though he was still far from considering himself a writer, this taste of creation stayed with him. The seed of theater had been planted. That same year, Anton faced personal tragedy when his grandfather, a freed serf who had worked hard to give his family a better life, passed away. Anton admired his grandfather's resilience, and the death reminded him of the fragility of life. Death, poverty, resilience, all these became familiar themes, and Anton absorbed them quietly, storing them for later. When he finally completed his schooling in Taganrog in 1879, Anton was no longer the boy who had sung in his father's choir. He had endured hunger, humiliation, and solitude, but he had also discovered his strength. He had learned how to survive on his own, how to observe life with sharp eyes, and how to transform pain into humor. More importantly, he had kept alive his dream of education. He decided to join his family in Moscow and enter university, determined to study medicine. The decision was both practical and noble. Medicine promised stability, and it appealed to his compassion for human suffering. As Anton boarded the train to Moscow, carrying little more than a suitcase and a determination forged in hardship, he was stepping into a new chapter of his life. The years of responsibility in Taganrog had given him endurance. The years ahead in Moscow would test his intellect, his creativity, and his health. But without the solitude and trials of those lonely teenage years, Anton Chekhov might never have become the man who could write with such delicate truth about the human condition. The boy who had been left behind had grown into a young man ready to take on not only his own future, but the future of his struggling family as well. And though he could not know it at the time, the discipline, humor, and resilience forged during these difficult years would echo in every story and play he would later create, giving them the depth and humanity that still move readers across the world. Chapter 4. The Schoolboy Who Listened More Than He Spoke. When Anton Chekhov arrived in Moscow in 1879, he was only 19 years old, carrying the weariness of hardship, but also the determination of someone who had already endured more than most boys his age. Moscow, with its wide boulevards, grand churches, and endless noise, must have seemed both intimidating and exciting. Compared to the small port town of Taganrog, the city was enormous, a place of opportunity, but also of struggle. The Chekhov family lived in cramped conditions on the outskirts of the city. They rented small, poorly heated rooms in wooden houses that seemed always on the edge of collapse. The family's financial troubles continued, and Pavel, the father, still failed to provide steady income. Anton quickly realized that if his family was to survive, he would have to carry much of the responsibility. His two older brothers were trying to earn money in small jobs, but it was never enough. From the start, Anton's student years were not just about study, they were about survival. In that same year, he entered the medical faculty of Moscow University. Becoming a doctor was a practical choice. It promised a steady career, a way to support his family, and perhaps a measure of dignity that his father had never managed to achieve. But medicine also appealed to Anton's natural curiosity about life. He wanted to understand the human body and, beyond that, the human condition. His first days at the university, however, were overwhelming. The lecture halls were vast, filled with hundreds of students. Professors spoke with authority, using complicated terminology that sometimes felt like a foreign language. But Anton listened attentively, never rushing to speak, always absorbing as much as possible. Outside the classroom, his days were even harder. He earned money by tutoring, just as he had in Taganrog. He also began writing short comic sketches and selling them to humorous magazines. These pieces were brief, sometimes no longer than a page, and often carried playful titles like The Complaints Book or A Living Chronicle. He signed them with various pseudonyms, as if he were still shy about attaching his true name to such work. Yet readers quickly noticed the sharpness of his humor. His stories were filled with ordinary people, a nervous clerk, a boastful policeman, a lazy student. They were not heroes, but they were alive, painted in quick, precise strokes. Though money was the main reason he wrote, something deeper was at work. Writing gave him relief from the pressures of daily life. It was his way of processing the struggles he faced, poverty, illness, fatigue, by transforming them into stories. His humor was not cruel but compassionate. He laughed at people's weaknesses while showing understanding of them. Already, without realizing it fully, he was shaping the style that would later become his hallmark. Life as a medical student was exhausting. Lectures began early, and laboratory work lasted for hours. Afterward, Anton would rush across the city to give private lessons, sometimes arriving at small apartments where students waited with dull eyes and inattentive minds. Late at night, when the city grew quiet, he sat at his desk to write. Often, he worked until dawn, then returned to classes with little sleep. His health, never strong, suffered. He coughed frequently, though he tried to ignore the signs. Despite his heavy schedule, Anton never lost his curiosity about people. He watched closely his professors, his fellow students, his patients during medical practice. He noticed their gestures, their nervous habits, their ways of speaking. While other students rushed through their tasks, Anton lingered, observing the smallest details. He listened more than he spoke, but his silence was not emptiness. It was attention. This quiet listening would later allow him to capture characters with remarkable authenticity. Family life remained difficult. His mother tried to keep the household together with warmth, while his father continued to burden the family with his failures. Anton's brothers often drank too much, their artistic ambitions clashing with the reality of poverty. In such chaos, Anton became the steady center. He was not only a student and a writer, but also a breadwinner, a peacemaker, and sometimes even a father to his younger siblings. This responsibility weighed on him, but it also deepened his understanding of duty and sacrifice. In 1880, Anton began to publish more frequently. His short sketches became popular in magazines like Strakoza, The Dragonfly, and Oskolki Fragments. The editors valued his ability to create lively scenes in just a few lines, and they paid him small but regular sums. With this income, Anton helped pay rent, bought food, and even supported his brother's studies. Writing had become not only his second occupation, but an essential lifeline for his family. Still, he never abandoned his studies. He believed deeply in the importance of medicine. "Medicine is my lawful wife," he once wrote, "and literature is my mistress." This metaphor revealed his divided life. Medicine gave him stability, but literature gave him joy. He carried his medical bag through muddy Moscow streets to visit patients, and then, back at his desk, he carried his pen across the page to bring characters to life. By the early 1880s, Anton had begun to attract notice in literary circles. Though still seen as a humorist, critics observed that his sketches contained more than jokes. They revealed an unusual precision of language, a sensitivity to the smallest details, and a compassion that was rare among satirical writers. He wrote with clarity, without wasting words, and yet each story carried emotional weight. One of the remarkable qualities of Anton during this period was his refusal to complain. Many young students in his position, burdened with poverty, overwork, and illness, might have given in to despair. Anton, however, faced each difficulty with humor and determination. He made fun of his own struggles, often turning them into material for stories. If he could not change his situation, he could at least laugh at it. This resilience gave him a strength that carried him through the hardest years. Walking through Moscow, Anton continued to collect impressions. The city itself became a great book, filled with endless characters, merchants shouting at markets, women carrying baskets of bread, policemen scolding children, beggars sitting silently at church doors. Every corner of the city offered him material. He was like a camera, quietly capturing images, later developing them into stories that revealed the truth of Russian life. By the time he reached the final years of his medical studies, Anton had already published hundreds of short pieces. He was becoming well known in the world of light journalism, though not yet respected as a serious writer. But within him, a shift was taking place. The more he wrote, the more he realized that humor alone was not enough. He began to search for deeper meaning, to explore the sadness beneath laughter, the loneliness behind everyday routines. This transformation would soon lead to the stories that made him one of the greatest writers of his time. For now, however, Anton remained the quiet schoolboy who listened more than he spoke. In lecture halls, in patient rooms, and in family arguments, he observed carefully, storing away details with remarkable precision. His silence was not weakness but strength, a deep reservoir of attention that would later allow him to write with such striking honesty. In the shadows of poverty and illness, Chekhov was building the foundations of both his professions. As a doctor, he was learning how to heal bodies. As a writer, he was beginning to heal hearts. And though he was not yet fully aware of it, the city that often exhausted him was also shaping his voice, preparing him to step beyond humorous sketches into the lasting world of literature. Chapter 5: Moscow and the Medical Student's Journey. In 1884, after years of exhaustion, sacrifice, and relentless discipline, Anton Chekhov graduated from the medical faculty of Moscow University. For many students, graduation meant celebration, but for Anton it was a quiet milestone reached under the heavy weight of responsibility. He was only 24 years old, yet he already carried the burden of supporting an entire family. Medicine promised a steady profession, but his life was far from secure. Tuberculosis had begun to make itself known through persistent coughing, though he refused to admit the seriousness of his condition. The diploma in his hand symbolized more than personal achievement. It was a lifeline for his family. Almost immediately after graduation, Anton began to practice medicine. His patients were often poor villagers or struggling city dwellers who could not pay for treatment. He visited them in their small wooden houses, carrying his doctor's bag through muddy streets, sometimes working long hours for little or no money. To Anton, healing the sick was not a matter of wealth, but of duty. He treated the rich and the poor with equal care, believing that illness stripped away the divisions of class and revealed the shared fragility of human life. Yet, while medicine demanded his time, writing demanded his soul. He continued to publish short sketches and humorous tales, many of them under pseudonyms. His reputation as a talented humorist grew rapidly, and his works appeared regularly in popular magazines. Editors admired his ability to capture a scene in a few sentences and to create laughter without cruelty. For a while, it seemed that literature and medicine could exist side by side in his life. But as his literary voice matured, Anton realized that writing was not merely a pastime or a way to earn extra money. It was becoming his second profession, one that called him as strongly as medicine. The dual life was exhausting. Days were filled with medical visits and nights with writing. He lived on little sleep, drank endless cups of tea, and pushed his weakening body far beyond its limits. His mother worried constantly about his health, but Anton dismissed her concerns with humor, joking about his coughs and fevers as if they were merely inconveniences. Humor was his shield, protecting him from the fear that his illness might shorten his life. In 1885, Chekhov's work began to take a more serious turn. While he continued to write comic pieces, he also experimented with stories that revealed the sadness, loneliness, and quiet struggles of ordinary people. He moved away from simple jokes toward a more subtle exploration of human behavior. Critics and readers noticed The stories showed a new depth, a blending of comedy and tragedy that felt more true to life. Anton was no longer only a humorist. He was becoming a storyteller of remarkable sensitivity. One of the most significant moments of this transformation came in 1886, when he published a collection of stories titled Motley Stories. The book was well received, and it introduced him to the world of serious literature. For the first time, critics praised not only his wit, but also his humanity, his ability to reveal the unspoken pain behind ordinary lives. The same year, the respected publisher Alexei Suvorin, owner of the influential newspaper Novoye Vremya, invited Chekhov to contribute. This connection gave Anton both recognition and stability, though it also introduced him into the complicated world of literary politics. At the same time, Chekhov's medical practice continued to shape his art. Each patient he treated left a mark on him. He saw the quiet dignity of the poor as they endured pain without complaint, the fear in the eyes of children, the exhaustion of mothers, the bitterness of old men facing death. These encounters deepened his compassion and enriched his writing with authenticity. Medicine taught him to look directly at suffering without turning away, and that same honesty became the hallmark of his stories. But the demands of his double life were heavy. Anton often described medicine as his lawful wife and literature as his mistress. It was a witty remark, but it captured the tension he felt. Medicine provided stability, but literature gave him joy. He could not abandon either. In truth, the two professions nourished each other. Medicine gave him material and insight, while literature gave him the strength to endure the hardships of medical work. By 1887, Chekhov had established himself as one of the most promising young writers in Russia. That year he published The Steppe, a long story that described the Russian landscape through the eyes of a child traveling across endless fields. The work was a turning point. It won him the Pushkin Prize in 1888 and secured his reputation as a serious literary figure. The story revealed his growing mastery of atmosphere, his ability to paint with words not only characters, but entire landscapes, alive with detail and emotion. The recognition brought both joy and pressure. Critics now expected more from him, and Anton, modest by nature, felt uneasy with fame. He disliked public attention and avoided literary gatherings whenever possible. Instead, he preferred quiet evenings at home, writing letters, caring for his patients, and spending time with his family. Yet he could not avoid the fact that his voice was being heard more widely, and that his responsibility as a writer was growing. During these years, Chekhov also began to experiment with drama. His first serious play, Ivanov, was staged in 1887. It was a daring attempt to move beyond comedy into the darker territories of disillusionment and despair. The play received mixed reviews, but it revealed Anton's ambition to create something new in Russian theater, a drama that reflected life not through grand events, but through the subtle interplay of everyday emotions. Meanwhile, his health continued to trouble him. The signs of tuberculosis grew clearer: persistent coughing, weakness, fevers. Still, Anton refused to slow down. He continued to travel, to visit patients, and to write tirelessly. Perhaps he sensed even then that his time might be limited, and that he had to accomplish as much as possible while strength remained. By the late 1880s, Chekhov had become both a respected doctor and a rising literary star. His stories were being read across Russia. His plays were beginning to attract attention, and his medical practice was deeply valued by the communities he served. Yet beneath the surface of success, he lived in constant tension between medicine and literature, between health and illness, between responsibility and creativity. This period of his life was a journey not only through the streets of Moscow, but also through the landscapes of the human soul. As a doctor, he touched bodies. As a writer, he touched hearts. And though he was still at the beginning of his career, it was already clear that Anton Chekhov's voice was unique, quiet yet powerful, simple yet profound, humorous yet deeply humane. In these years, he proved that one could serve both science and art, that one could live not for oneself, but for others, and still leave behind something lasting. The medical student who had once listened more than he spoke was now speaking through his stories, and the world was beginning to listen. Copyright notice. Cool English channel. All rights reserved. This video and its content are protected by copyright law. Unauthorized copying, redistribution, re-uploading, or modification of this content is strictly prohibited and may result in legal action. Respect the creator. Do not steal. Chapter 6. The First Steps of a Writer. The year 1888 marked a turning point in Anton Chekhov's life. Until then, he had been known mainly as a gifted humorist, a writer who could amuse readers with quick sketches and lively caricatures. But with the publication of The Steppe, Chekhov's literary identity began to shift. This long story, which followed a young boy traveling across the Russian countryside, revealed a new voice, lyrical, thoughtful, and profoundly observant. It was not about great events or heroic figures. Instead, it was about the endless landscape, the colors of dawn and dusk, the voices of peasants and traders, the quiet loneliness of travel. For many readers, it was the first time they realized Chekhov was more than a humorist. He was a serious writer with the power to capture the soul of Russia itself. When The Steppe won the Pushkin Prize in 1888, it confirmed his rising status in the literary world. For Anton, the recognition was both satisfying and surprising. He had not expected to be honored with a prize named after the nation's greatest poet. Yet the award also brought new pressure. Critics began to expect from him not only wit, but depth, not only amusement, but truth. He would have to live up to the promise that The Steppe suggested. At the same time, Chekhov continued to balance his dual professions. He was still practicing medicine, often traveling to small villages to treat peasants who could not afford other doctors. He carried his medical bag through rain and snow, sometimes spending nights in modest huts, surrounded by the smell of earth and livestock. Illness was everywhere: typhus, pneumonia, and tuberculosis, the same disease that slowly gnawed at his own lungs. These journeys deepened his understanding of rural life, giving him material for stories that spoke with authenticity about the struggles of ordinary people. It was during these years that Chekhov's short stories reached a new maturity. He wrote Sleepy, a haunting tale of a young servant girl overwhelmed by exhaustion, and A Boring Story, which explored the inner life of an aging professor confronting death. In these works, humor faded into the background, replaced by compassion and quiet tragedy. Chekhov avoided moral lessons or grand conclusions. He preferred to show life as it was, unresolved and imperfect. This subtle approach puzzled some critics, who were used to stories that made clear statements. But others recognized in him a new kind of realism, one that reflected the uncertainty of human existence. In 1887, before The Steppe appeared, Chekhov had also made his first serious attempt at drama with Ivanov. The play told the story of a disillusioned landowner, crushed by debt and personal despair. It was a bold experiment, quite different from the comedies he had written earlier. The premiere received mixed reactions. Some praised its honesty, while others found it dark and chaotic. Anton himself was dissatisfied, feeling that he had not yet mastered the stage. Yet the experience taught him valuable lessons about dramatic form, lessons that would bear fruit in later masterpieces. Despite the uncertainty, Anton did not give up on theater. He was fascinated by the stage, by the way words could become living flesh and blood when spoken by actors. He attended rehearsals, observed the behavior of directors and performers, and studied the mechanics of dialogue. Gradually, he began to see drama not as a field of loud speeches and exaggerated emotions, but as a mirror of everyday life, where silence and hesitation could be as powerful as words. Meanwhile, his family life remained complicated. Though his earnings from literature had increased, his family still relied heavily on him. His father's strictness had softened with age, but the old conflicts had not disappeared entirely. Anton often felt torn between the need to support his relatives and his desire for independence. He longed for quiet spaces where he could write without interruption. Yet his sense of duty bound him to the crowded household. It was a tension that never fully left him. Chekhov's health, too, was becoming more troubling. His cough worsened, sometimes leaving him exhausted after a day of medical visits and writing. Friends and family urged him to rest, but Anton resisted. He felt that to pause would be to waste precious time. Instead, he pushed forward, hiding his weaknesses behind jokes and laughter. To his friends, he often appeared cheerful, even playful, but privately, he admitted his fears in letters. He knew tuberculosis could end his life early, and this knowledge gave urgency to his work. Despite illness and responsibility, Anton's reputation grew. By 1889, he was one of the most widely read writers in Russia. His stories appeared in major newspapers and magazines, and his name was spoken in literary circles with respect. What set him apart was not only his style, but also his empathy. He refused to judge his characters harshly, whether depicting peasants, students, or aristocrats. He showed them as flawed but human, capable of both cruelty and kindness. Readers recognized themselves in his pages, and this quiet recognition was more powerful than any sermon. Around this time, Chekhov began to attract the attention of intellectuals and artists in Moscow and St. Petersburg. He met writers, critics, and actors, though he remained modest and often shy in such gatherings. Fame did not change his nature. He continued to live simply, preferring the company of close friends and family to glittering salons. Yet his influence was spreading. Other writers admired his ability to capture life in small details, to reveal entire worlds in a single gesture or glance. By the early 1890s, Anton Chekhov was firmly established as a leading figure in Russian literature. He was still young, not yet 35, but his body of work already showed remarkable variety and depth. He had proven himself not only as a humorist, but as a master of the short story, capable of moving readers with tales of laughter, sorrow, and quiet beauty. His early steps in drama hinted at even greater achievements to come. The boy who had once scribbled jokes in cheap magazines had become a serious writer whose voice carried across the country. Yet for Chekhov, there was no sense of triumph. He remained modest, often doubting his own abilities, often dissatisfied with his work. What mattered to him was not fame or prizes, but the search for truth, the attempt to capture life as it was lived, without embellishment or exaggeration. The first steps of his literary career had been taken. The path ahead would lead him deeper into the complexities of the human heart, into plays that would transform theater, and into stories that would stand among the finest ever written. But these years, the years of the steppe, of Ivanov, of humble beginnings on the stage and in literature, were the years when Anton Chekhov found his true voice, a voice that would echo far beyond his time. Chapter 7. Into the Provinces and Beyond. By the late 1880s, Anton Chekhov was no longer an unknown humorist. His reputation as a writer of depth and compassion had grown, his medical practice had earned him respect, and his first ventures into drama had made him a figure of interest on the stage. Yet, despite success, Chekhov remained restless. Life in Moscow, with its demands and expectations, felt heavy. The cough in his chest reminded him daily that his time might be limited. He longed for distance, for an escape into something larger than himself. That longing soon found an answer in one of the most ambitious journeys of his life, his expedition to Sakhalin Island. Sakhalin, a distant and harsh island in the Russian Far East, was infamous in the 19th century. It was a penal colony, home to convicts, exiles, and settlers forced to survive in extreme conditions. For most Russians, the island was a name on a map, associated with suffering and isolation. For Chekhov, however, it became an obsession. In 1890, he announced that he would travel thousands of miles across Siberia to reach the island and study its people. His family and friends were shocked. Why would a young man, already ill with tuberculosis, choose such a dangerous and exhausting journey? Anton's reasons were complex. Partly, he was driven by scientific curiosity. He wanted to conduct a census of the island's inhabitants, documenting their lives with the precision of a doctor and the empathy of a writer. Partly, he was motivated by a deep moral concern. He had heard reports of the terrible conditions faced by prisoners and settlers, and he wanted to see the truth with his own eyes. And partly, the journey was personal, an escape from Moscow's pressures, a test of endurance, perhaps even a way to measure his own fragile strength against the vastness of Siberia. In the spring of 1890, Chekhov set out. He traveled by train, carriage, and riverboat, covering more than 6,000 miles. The journey itself was a story. Long days of jolting rides through endless forests, nights spent in rustic inns or under open skies, encounters with peasants, officials, and fellow travelers. Chekhov recorded his impressions in letters to friends, describing the vast landscapes, the monotony of the steppe, the beauty of rivers, and the exhaustion of constant travel. His tone was often light, even humorous, but beneath it lay a sense of awe at the immensity of Russia and the resilience of its people. When he finally reached Sakhalin after 3 months of travel, he threw himself into work with characteristic energy. For several months, he interviewed convicts, settlers, guards, and their families. He visited prisons, hospitals, and homes, often spending long hours listening to stories of crime, punishment, and survival. With a doctor's eye, he noted details of health, hygiene, and living conditions. With a writer's heart, he captured the emotions behind the facts, the despair of prisoners serving life sentences, the quiet endurance of women raising children in exile, the brutality and indifference of officials. The work was exhausting, especially for a man in fragile health. Chekhov often rose early and worked late, coughing through his days but refusing to rest. He took meticulous notes, filling pages with statistics and observations. He wanted his study to be more than anecdotal. He wanted it to be scientific, a document that could not be ignored. At the same time, he never lost sight of the human stories behind the numbers. To him, every statistic represented a life, every prisoner a person with a history and a soul. By the time he left Sakhalin in the fall of 1890, Chekhov had gathered an immense amount of material. He returned to Moscow physically weakened but intellectually enriched. For the next several years, he worked intermittently on what would become Sakhalin Island, a detailed account of the penal colony. Published in installments and later as a book, it combines statistical analysis with vivid descriptions, creating a unique blend of science and literature. Critics were astonished. The book was unlike anything Chekhov had written before. It was not a story or a play, but a social document of great importance, exposing the harsh realities of the penal system and calling for reform. For Chekhov himself, the Sakhalin journey was transformative. It deepened his compassion and sharpened his sense of justice. He had always been sensitive to suffering, but now his awareness was anchored in first-hand experience of human misery on a massive scale. The voices he heard on Sakhalin, the voices of criminals, victims, children, and the forgotten, echoed in his later works, giving them new depth and urgency. The journey also revealed another side of Chekhov, his determination and courage. Many had doubted that a frail young writer could endure such a demanding expedition, but Anton proved them wrong. He had faced hardship, illness, and isolation, and had emerged with a work that mattered not only to literature, but to society. The trip was a victory of will over weakness, of curiosity over comfort. After returning from Sakhalin, Chekhov sought rest. He spent time in the countryside, recovering his strength. The vast journey had left him tired but also restless. He could not remain long in one place. Travel had opened his eyes, and he began to move frequently between Moscow, St. Petersburg, and rural estates. Wherever he went, he carried his notebooks, writing stories that reflected the lives he had seen. The early 1890s became a period of remarkable productivity. Stories like Ward No. 6, a chilling tale of madness and indifference in a provincial hospital, bore the mark of his Sakhalin experience. The story's atmosphere of confinement and despair clearly echoed the prisons he had visited, while its critique of authority reflected his observations of the penal system. Other works, too, carried hints of his journey, the sense of distance, the awareness of hidden suffering, the insistence on truth. Yet Chekhov remained modest about his achievement. He did not present himself as a reformer or a hero. He preferred to speak lightly of his journey, often making jokes about the hardships he had endured. But those who read Sakhalin Island understood that it was more than a travel account. It was a moral testimony, a reminder that even the most distant corners of the empire held lives worthy of attention. For Chekhov, the journey into the provinces and beyond was not only geographical but spiritual. It carried him beyond the boundaries of comfort and success into the raw edges of human existence. It showed him suffering without disguise, endurance without praise, and cruelty without excuse. It demanded from him not only sympathy but courage, not only imagination but honesty. When he returned from Sakhalin, he was no longer merely a promising young writer or a doctor with a talent for stories. He had become something greater, a witness to his time, a voice for the voiceless, and a writer whose work carried both beauty and conscience. Chapter 8. Chekhov the Playwright. In the years following his return from Sakhalin Island, Anton Chekhov entered a new stage of his career. He had already achieved recognition as one of Russia's finest short story writers, but now his attention turned increasingly toward the theater. It was not an entirely new direction. He had experimented with plays before, but in the 1890s, his vision of drama deepened and matured. What emerged was a body of work that would change the course of theater forever. Chekhov's early attempts at drama had been uneven. Ivanov, written in 1887, had shown promise, but left him dissatisfied. He felt he had not yet mastered the stage, that he had relied too much on heavy speeches and conventional structures. For several years afterward, he returned mainly to prose, refining his craft through short stories. Yet theater remained in his mind. He attended performances, observed actors, and thought about how plays might reflect life, not in exaggerated gestures, but in subtle details. By the mid-1890s, this idea began to take form. Chekhov envisioned a new kind of drama, one that abandoned melodrama and embraced the rhythms of everyday life. Instead of grand heroes or villains, he wanted ordinary people, doctors, teachers, landowners, dreamers, caught in the small struggles of existence. He believed that true drama could arise not from loud action, but from quiet tension, from pauses and silences, from the things left unsaid. The first great expression of this vision was The Seagull, written in 1895. The play centered on a group of characters gathered at a country estate, a young playwright named Treplev, his famous actress mother Arkadina, the aspiring actress Nina, and others. Their lives crossed in love, disappointment, ambition, and despair. On the surface, little seemed to happen. Conversations drifted, dreams failed, and hearts broke in silence. But beneath the quiet surface lay deep emotions: longing, jealousy, frustration, hope. Chekhov submitted The Seagull to the Alexandrinsky Theatre in St. Petersburg, and in 1896 it was staged for the first time. The premiere was a disaster. The audience, expecting conventional drama, grew restless and even hostile. Actors unfamiliar with Chekhov's subtle style delivered lines too loudly or too flatly, missing the delicate rhythm of pauses and silences. Critics mocked the play as confusing and dull. Anton, deeply hurt, left the theater during the performance and swore he would never write another play. Yet The Seagull was not dead. Among those who saw its potential was Vladimir Nemirovich Danchenko, a playwright and teacher who, together with the actor and director Konstantin Stanislavski, would soon establish the Moscow Art Theatre. They recognized in Chekhov's play something revolutionary, a new kind of realism that could transform the stage if performed with the right sensitivity. In 1898, 2 years after the disastrous premiere, the Moscow Art Theatre staged The Seagull again, this time under Stanislavski's direction. The result was electric. The audience, guided by the careful naturalism of Stanislavski's production, finally understood the play. They saw its truth, its humanity, its quiet beauty. What had seemed dull before now felt alive with subtle tension. The performance was a triumph, not only for Chekhov, but for the Moscow Art Theatre itself, which adopted the image of a seagull as its emblem. The success of The Seagull marked a new chapter in Chekhov's career. He was no longer just a writer of stories. He was now recognized as a major dramatist. Encouraged, he continued to explore this new form. In 1899, he completed Uncle Vanya, a reworking of an earlier play called The Wood Demon. Like The Seagull, Uncle Vanya focused on ordinary lives. At a provincial estate, characters wrestled with disappointment and unfulfilled dreams. The Professor Serebrakov, his young wife Yelena, the disillusioned Uncle Vanya, and the idealistic Dr. Astrov all longed for something beyond their reach. Love, purpose, happiness, yet life moved on, indifferent to their desires. Performed by the Moscow Art Theater, Uncle Vanya confirmed Chekhov's place as a leading playwright. Audiences and critics began to appreciate his subtlety. They realized that his plays were not about plots in the usual sense, but about moods, atmospheres, and the slow passage of time. They captured the feeling of life itself, how days slip by, how hopes fade, how laughter mixes with sorrow. During these years, Chekhov's relationship with the Moscow Art Theater deepened. Stanislavski and Nemirovich Danchenko admired him, though they sometimes struggled to interpret his delicate intentions. Chekhov, for his part, valued their dedication but often grew frustrated with Stanislavski's tendency to add too much psychological analysis or heavy emphasis. Anton insisted that his plays should be performed lightly, almost as comedies, with attention to the ordinary rhythms of speech and behavior. To him, life was tragic and comic at once, and the stage should reflect that mixture. As his health declined in the late 1890s, Chekhov moved more frequently to the countryside, seeking clean air and rest. Yet even in illness, his creativity did not falter. He continued to write stories, but his main focus became drama. In these plays, he found a way to express his vision of life more fully than in prose. The theater allowed him to show not only words, but silences, not only actions, but inaction, not only individual lives, but the shared atmosphere of a group. By the turn of the century, Chekhov had transformed himself from a promising story writer into a dramatist of international importance. The Seagull and Uncle Vanya had opened the way, but greater works still lay ahead. His imagination, sharpened by years of observation and reflection, was ready to give birth to plays that would define his legacy. What distinguished Chekhov's drama from others was its refusal to give easy answers. His characters did not find sudden redemption or neat conclusions. Instead, they endured, they dreamed, they failed, and they continued. Their lives were unresolved, just as life itself often is. To some, this felt frustrating. To others, it felt profoundly true. Chekhov once said, "The role of the artist is to ask questions, not to answer them." Nowhere was this philosophy clearer than in his plays. He asked, what happens to people when their dreams fade? How do they bear the weight of time? How do they live with both hope and despair? His plays did not resolve these questions, but in their honesty lay their power. By the end of the 1890s, the boy who had once written comic sketches for magazines had become the playwright who would reshape modern theater. The road had not been easy. His first major play had been mocked. His health was weakening, and his modest nature often made him doubt his own talent. Yet his persistence, his quiet courage, and his belief in truth had carried him forward. The next years would bring his crowning achievements, Three Sisters and The Cherry Orchard. But already, with The Seagull and Uncle Vanya, Anton Chekhov had proven that theater could be something new, a stage where life itself, with all its laughter, sadness, and silence, could unfold in its simplest and deepest form. Chapter 9. The Final Years. At the beginning of the 20th century, Anton Chekhov stood at the height of his artistic powers. Though illness shadowed him, his reputation was secure. He was no longer simply the promising short story writer of the 1880s, or the cautious playwright of the 1890s. He was now widely recognized as one of Russia's greatest living authors, a man whose stories and plays had touched the hearts of readers and audiences alike. Yet these final years, from 1900 to 1904, would be both his most fruitful and his most painful. Chekhov's health had never fully recovered after his years of medical practice, his exhausting trip to Sakhalin, and the constant strain of writing. Tuberculosis, the disease that had haunted him since the late 1880s, had become an inseparable part of his life. He suffered from fatigue, coughing fits, and periods of weakness that forced him to rest. Despite this, he continued to write, as if aware that time was limited. In the quiet hours at his home in Yalta, he worked slowly but steadily on new plays and stories, often between visits to doctors and therapeutic trips to the countryside. In 1900, the Moscow Art Theatre produced his new play, Three Sisters. The story unfolded in a provincial town where the Prozorov family, three sisters and their brother, dreamed of returning to Moscow, the city of their childhood. The sisters were intelligent, refined, and cultured, but trapped in a dull, provincial life filled with disappointment. Their longing for Moscow became a symbol of a greater desire, a wish for meaning, for change, for happiness that never arrived. The first performances of Three Sisters were greeted with admiration but also with a certain sadness. Audiences recognized in the play the familiar Chekhovian blend of humor and melancholy, but now with an even deeper sense of resignation. Life in the play seemed to drift forward with no resolution. The sisters' dreams remained dreams. Their Moscow remained distant. And yet, in their endurance, in their ability to continue living despite disappointment, there was also dignity. Chekhov once again had captured the paradox of existence, that life could be both unbearable and bearable at the same time. During the rehearsals of Three Sisters, Chekhov grew closer to Olga Nipper, one of the leading actresses of the Moscow Art Theatre. She was intelligent, warm, and strong, and she admired his talent deeply. Their relationship developed quietly but steadily, even as Chekhov struggled with poor health. In 1901, they were married in a small ceremony attended by only a few friends. The marriage brought Anton joy and companionship. Though circumstances meant they often lived apart, he in Yalta for the sake of his health, she in Moscow for her acting career. Their letters from this period reveal the tenderness of their bond. Anton, usually reserved, wrote with affection and humor, teasing her gently or describing the small details of his daily life. Olga, in turn, expressed her devotion and shared news of the theater. For both, the letters became a lifeline, a way to bridge the distance that illness and work had created. Despite his happiness with Olga, Chekhov's physical decline continued. In Yalta, he tried to live as comfortably as possible. He cultivated his garden, welcomed visitors such as Maxim Gorky and Leo Tolstoy, and cared for his animals. He enjoyed small pleasures, fresh fruit, a walk in the orchard, the company of friends. But even these moments were shadowed by coughing and exhaustion. Still, he remained outwardly calm, never complaining more than necessary, always hiding the true severity of his illness. In 1903, Chekhov began work on what would be his final play, The Cherry Orchard. It was a play about change, about the passing of one era and the uncertain arrival of another. The story centered on a noble family who, unable to pay their debts, must sell their beloved estate, including its famous cherry orchard. To some characters, the orchard represented beauty, memory, and a lost past. To others, it symbolized useless nostalgia in a world moving toward progress and practicality. Chekhov wrote The Cherry Orchard with difficulty. His illness slowed him, and at times he feared he would not finish. Yet he pressed on, weaving into the play both comedy and sorrow. He insisted that it was a comedy, even a farce, though audiences and directors often interpreted it as tragic. For Chekhov, the humor of life was inseparable from its sadness. People laughed even as their worlds collapsed. When The Cherry Orchard premiered at the Moscow Art Theatre in 1904, it was both a triumph and a farewell. The audience recognized its power and depth, but they also sensed that Chekhov himself was nearing the end. The play's themes of loss, memory, and transition seemed to mirror his own life, as if he was saying goodbye not only to the stage, but to the world. That same year, his health reached a critical point. Doctors urged him to seek treatment abroad, and in the summer, he traveled with Olga to the German spa town of Badenweiler in the Black Forest. The journey was difficult, but Anton remained outwardly calm. even making light of his condition. In Badenweiler, he received medical attention and tried to rest, but the disease had progressed too far. On the night of July 2, 1904, Chekhov's condition worsened suddenly. A doctor was called, and Anton, with quiet dignity, asked for a glass of champagne. After drinking it, he lay back and passed away peacefully at the age of 44. Olga was with him, holding his hand. His body was returned to Russia, and thousands came to pay their respects. Writers, actors, students, and ordinary readers all felt they had lost someone who had spoken to their hearts. Chekhov was buried in Moscow, near the graves of other great Russian artists. His death left a silence, but his works, his stories, his plays, his letters, remained alive. In those last years, Chekhov had created works that captured the essence of human existence with unmatched subtlety. Three Sisters and the Cherry Orchard were not just plays. They were reflections of life itself, funny, sad, tender, and true. His marriage to Olga brought him love in his final days, and though illness had darkened his life, he never allowed bitterness to dominate his spirit. The final chapter of Chekhov's life was brief, but it was filled with creativity, courage, and quiet dignity. He had given his voice to ordinary people, to their dreams and disappointments. And in doing so, he had given voice to humanity itself. The man who had begun as the son of a struggling grocer in Taganrog, who had written comic sketches to pay for medical school, had ended his life as one of the greatest dramatists and storytellers in history. Chapter 10: Legacy and Influence. When Anton Chekhov died in the summer of 1904, Russia lost more than a writer. It lost a voice that had quietly, yet profoundly, changed the way people looked at themselves. His stories and plays had no heroes in the traditional sense, no great battles or dramatic climaxes. Instead, they revealed life as it was truly lived: small disappointments, fleeting joys, conversations that trailed into silence, dreams that faded but never completely died. In showing this, Chekhov gave literature and theater a new language, one that continues to resonate across the world. The first measure of his legacy was immediate. The Moscow Art Theater, under Konstantin Stanislavski and Vladimir Nemirovich Danchenko, became inseparably linked with Chekhov's name. His plays were central to their repertoire, and they shaped the famous Stanislavski system of acting, which later developed into method acting in the 20th century. Actors who once declaimed loudly and dramatically were now required to capture silence, hesitation, and the inner life of characters. Chekhov's plays demanded it. His characters did not speak in heroic monologues. They spoke in fragments, in half-finished thoughts, in the rhythm of everyday life. To portray them truthfully, actors had to look within themselves, to live the role rather than merely perform it. This revolution in theater rippled outward. In Europe, playwrights such as Henrik Ibsen and August Strindberg had already begun to move toward realism, but Chekhov pushed it further, replacing conflict-driven drama with atmosphere and subtext. In The Seagull, Uncle Vanya, Three Sisters, and The Cherry Orchard, the real drama lay not in the plot, but beneath the surface, in what was unsaid. Later writers and directors, Eugene O'Neill in America, Samuel Beckett in Ireland, Harold Pinter in Britain, would draw on this Chekhovian inheritance, exploring silence, ambiguity, and the quiet struggles of human beings. In literature, Chekhov's short stories became a model for the modern form. Before him, short stories often relied on twists, morals, or clear resolutions. Chekhov rejected these conventions. His stories often ended without conclusion, leaving readers in the middle of life with no neat answers. "Life is complex," he once said, "and it should be represented as it is." This approach influenced generations of writers. James Joyce's Dubliners echoes Chekhov's style in its depiction of ordinary people caught in small epiphanies. Catherine Mansfield admired him deeply, modeling her own impressionistic stories on his. Ernest Hemingway praised Chekhov's ability to write simply about the truth, and his own minimalist prose owes much to Chekhov's restraint. Raymond Carver, in the late 20th century, was often described as a modern Chekhov, his stories capturing working-class lives with the same quiet dignity. Beyond literature and theater, Chekhov's influence was also moral and humanistic. His works conveyed compassion without sentimentality, showing people as they were, with their flaws and their strengths. He did not preach or judge. Instead, he observed with precision and empathy. Readers felt recognized, seen in their ordinariness, and this recognition itself was a form of respect. In this sense, Chekhov's legacy lies not only in style but also in attitude, an insistence on treating human beings with understanding. In Russia, his presence remains deeply rooted. Taganrog, his birthplace, has been transformed into a city of memory. The small house where he was born is preserved as a museum. Yalta, where he spent his later years, holds the Chekhov House Museum, where visitors can walk through the garden he loved. His plays are performed in Russian theaters every year, and his stories are studied in schools. For Russians, Chekhov represents not just an artist, but a mirror of their national character, gentle, ironic, enduring, always balancing suffering with humor. Internationally, his reach is equally vast. The Seagull was first performed in English in 1911 in London, and since then his plays have become staples of theater worldwide. From New York to Tokyo, from Paris to Buenos Aires, productions of Uncle Vanya or The Cherry Orchard continue to draw audiences. Directors reinterpret them constantly, sometimes setting them in modern apartments, sometimes keeping the 19th century Russian backdrop. Yet regardless of setting, the plays remain timeless because the emotions they portray, longing, disappointment, endurance, belong to all people in all eras. Film has also embraced Chekhov. Adaptations of his stories and plays appear regularly, sometimes faithfully set in Russia, sometimes transposed to new contexts. His influence can even be felt in films that do not name him, in the way directors explore silence, the passage of time, or the quiet details of ordinary lives. Chekhov's medical background shaped another part of his legacy. Though he often claimed medicine was his lawful wife and literature his mistress, the two were deeply intertwined. His understanding of human suffering was not abstract. It came from years of treating patients, of listening to their pain. In literature, this translated into a rare empathy. His stories of peasants, doctors, clerks, and landowners all carry the same weight of dignity, as though every life mattered equally. In this sense, Chekhov's legacy crosses boundaries of class and nationality, reminding us that human experience, in its essence, is universal. It is striking, too, how modern he remains. At a time when many writers offered grand narratives or ideological manifestos, Chekhov gave something subtler, ambiguity. He resisted clear messages, avoided didacticism, and refused to simplify life into lessons. This openness makes his work endlessly adaptable. In the 21st century, when readers and audiences are suspicious of certainty, Chekhov feels contemporary, his hesitations and questions closer to our own lives than the certainties of his age. Chekhov's influence also reaches into education. Teachers of literature and theater often introduce students to his work, not only for its artistic merit, but also for its vocabulary of human feeling. His stories demand attention to nuance, to silence, to irony. For learners of English, or any language, reading Chekhov is a training in subtlety, in the art of understanding what is not directly stated. Looking back, one is struck by the brevity of his life, only 44 years. And yet, within those years, he transformed both the short story and the theater. His legacy is not only in what he wrote, but in the new possibilities he opened for others. Without Chekhov, the 20th century's literature and drama would look very different, perhaps poorer, less subtle, less humane. Today, more than a century after his death, Anton Chekhov's words continue to echo. In classrooms, in theaters, in quiet corners where readers turn the pages of his stories, his presence is alive. His characters still dream of Moscow, still wait for love, still endure their disappointments with humor, and in their ordinariness, they remind us of ourselves. Chekhov once said that the role of an artist was not to solve problems, but to state them correctly. This modest definition of art remains one of his greatest gifts. By stating life correctly, without exaggeration, without distortion, he allowed generations of readers and audiences to recognize truth. His legacy, then, is not only artistic, but also deeply human, the simple, profound act of seeing life as it is and affirming its worth. Thus, from the quiet boy in Taganrog to the celebrated playwright in Moscow, from the doctor in country villages to the chronicler of human longing, Anton Pavlovich Chekhov's journey came full circle. He left behind no manifestos, no thunderous declarations, only stories and plays. Yet in their silence, their humor, and their tenderness, those works continue to speak louder than any manifesto could. And as long as people search for meaning in ordinary lives, Chekhov's voice will remain gentle but enduring, reminding us of the beauty and fragility of being human. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.